Okay, so the second half of our Phillips curve conversation is going to center around the long run Phillips curve. And similar to how the short run Phillips curve is a mirror of the SRAS, the long run Phillips curve is going to have a bit of a relationship to the LRAS, or the long run aggregate supply curve. But it helps to kind of build up this relationship with the knowledge we got in our prior video and in our prior lessons. So let's kind of rebuild where we were. We're going to start on our ADAS model over to the right here, and we've got an economy here that is at YP, at its potential level of output. And we know that potential level of output is an unemployment rate, and we also know that is the natural rate of unemployment, right? So when our economy is at potential, the unemployment rate should be at the natural rate of unemployment. So this economy is starting at YP, which means unemployment is the natural rate. And it is also starting here at a price level, which we'll drop in as price level E. And so we should be able to carry this information over again, and we've got that this economy is at a given point on the SRPC, price level E, and an unemployment rate here, which is also, again, the natural rate of unemployment. But so then let's look at what can happen to an economy when a shift or a change begins. So we'll start with just a quick review. If we have something like an increase in the aggregate demand curve, we know that our demand curve is going to shift over to the right, and we can read that that increase in aggregate demand is going to increase our output level. We're going to go beyond YP, or beyond potential output, and as our output level goes up, our unemployment level goes down. And as our unemployment level goes down and our output level goes up, we also know that this economy will see the beginnings of a rising price level, an increase in PL to PL2. And again, these are things that we can carry over a bit to our SRPC, and we can line these things up, that in order to shift up and to the right on our SRAS curve, we're going to shift up and to the left, which is going to show us this higher rate, and this really should be a rate of inflation E, this higher rate of inflation R2, and this lower unemployment rate, just like we said we were having based on the shift in aggregate demand. So that's all well and good in terms of the short run. But we also know that this point on our output graph on our ADAS is now not in a long run equilibrium. So the logical question is, how do we get from this short run circumstance and what's going to happen in the long run? And what's going to happen in the long run, not only on our ADAS model, but also in our Phillips curve? Well, we start on our ADAS model. In the long run, we know that a low unemployment rate is going to drive up wages. And so those higher wages are going to lead to a decrease in the SRAS curve. This is the process of self-correction, that the higher wages are higher input costs, which is going to decrease the SRAS curve, and slowly but surely our SRAS curve is going to shift back to the left so that our economy comes back to YP. So we're going to see output decrease back to YP. And we're going to see price level increase, PL3, right? PL will increase as that SRAS curve shifts to the left. And then most importantly, potentially, if we move ourselves back to YP, we know that our unemployment rate has to increase and go back to the natural rate of unemployment. So we've got two key factors happening here. We've got a higher price level and a higher unemployment rate. But how do we get both a higher price level, R2, and get ourselves back to the natural rate of unemployment? Well, we remember our shortcut from last time. This leftward shift of the SRAS is going to result in a rightward shift, a counter shift in the SRPC. And so we're going to find ourselves coming back over and back to the natural rate of unemployment, but we are back at the natural rate of unemployment at a higher price level. So what we can begin to say is that in the long run, we're beginning to see that this SRPC always returns to the natural rate of unemployment, or to that starting rate of unemployment. And that really what we begin to see is that in the long run, there is no relationship between unemployment and inflation, because regardless of our inflation rate, whether it's RE or R2 or any other level of inflation here, this economy is always going to find its way back to this point. And that's where we begin to get the concept of the LRPC. The LRPC is vertical at the natural rate of unemployment. And so that's kind of our beginning of what the LRPC is. This has a special name. In terms of the LRPC, we don't call this rate of unemployment the natural rate of unemployment. Instead, economists call it the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or Nairu. I actually have always disliked the way this acronym is kind of organized. It makes it sound to me like it is an inflation rate when it is really not an inflation rate, but a rate of unemployment. So I like to kind of rearrange this and say the Nairu is the unemployment rate at which inflation stays constant, at which inflation does not accelerate or change anymore. And the driving force behind this concept of Nairu is the idea that the SRPC can be shifted by expectations of inflation. We said when we started to put the SRPC together, first of all, that expectations of inflation were the primary driver and most important shifter here. And we also said that the SRPC itself was, in a sense, an expectation. It was an expected relationship. And Nairu tells us that that expected relationship can be true at any short-run moment, but that in the long run, the relationship begins to disintegrate. And the easiest way to see this again is to start to actually graph and visualize what's happening here. So let's start with this first example. What would happen to an economy and to a Phillips curve if the unemployment rate was above Nairu, if the unemployment rate was higher than normal? So we've got Nairu, an unemployment rate here on our x-axis, on our unemployment axis. And the question is, well, what happens on this SRPC if we are above that? So we could move over and we could imagine if we had a high unemployment rate. Well, we know that in the short run, a high unemployment rate, right, an unemployment rate that is higher than Nairu, would have to correspond to a given price level. But that price level would be lower, and really I shouldn't be saying price level, I should be saying inflation rate. That inflation rate would be lower than the kind of expected and normal inflation rate that people are used to in this economy. So Nairu creates for us kind of an equilibrium point of where our economy is supposed to be at a given unemployment rate and a given inflation rate. But it also shows us that at a high unemployment rate, we get a relatively low level of inflation. But if we were to stay at this high unemployment rate and this low rate of inflation, right, then we get low inflation, and over time, low inflation leads to low expectations of inflation. In other words, if I think inflation is going to be 3%, but it turns out to be 2%, and it persistently turns out to be 2% instead of 3%, then I'm probably going to begin to think, wait, I must be wrong. Inflation is probably going to be 2%. And we know that inflation expectations can shift this SRPC, so low expectations of inflation will lead to a downward shift of the SRPC over time. And that downward shift will bring this economy back to Nairu. In other words, any high unemployment rate, any persistently high unemployment rate, will always return us to Nairu at a lower inflation rate. And we can also begin to see the opposite. Imagine if the unemployment rate was below Nairu. So we could imagine a low unemployment rate here, and a low unemployment rate would correspond to a relatively higher inflation rate. Maybe this is an inflation rate of 5%. And while that might be an acceptable short-run outcome, an acceptable short-run point for an economy to be, this is kind of an expansion, right? Low unemployment, high inflation. We've got this expansion, that's normal. But the longer we stay at 5% inflation, the more I begin to believe that 5% inflation is normal. So in this case, an unemployment rate below Nairu leads to high inflation. And high inflation will, in the long run, lead to higher expected inflation. And higher expected inflation will shift the SRPC up to a higher expected relationship. So if I shift my SRPC up, I see that that high inflation rate now corresponds back to Nairu, back to the non-accelerating rate of inflation. And really, what Nairu begins to tell us is that any low unemployment rate leads to increasing inflation over time, and that any high unemployment rate leads to decreasing inflation over time, and that the only kind of stable point is maybe the best way to say it, right? The only stable or consistent point for inflation is when the unemployment rate is at that natural rate, or at that Nairu, that non-accelerating rate of unemployment. And this economy will always move back towards Nairu as anything outside of Nairu becomes unexpected and becomes kind of unsustainable with the way the economy is supposed to work in the long run. Just like the AD-AS model shows us that we always come back to YP. And YP represents not only an output level, but also a level of unemployment. Just the way Nairu is representing a level of unemployment where our economy kind of is driven or drawn to be.